David Jones laughed at his waitress's warning about her brother, slamming her face into the bar to teach her respect in front of a frozen crowd. He didn't realize the city's most dangerous mafia boss was sitting 10 feet away, abandoning his whiskey to deliver a lesson that would end David's life without spilling a drop of blood. When the man in the black suit whispered, "Let her go," David realized too late that the predator was already in the room. If this story pulled you in, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss what's coming next. I've got another unforgettable story dropping tomorrow, and while you're here, jump into the comments and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing our community from all around the world. Alright, let's get back into it. The Friday night shift at Redwood Tavern had settled into its usual rhythm when the air began to curdle, one of those suffocating, oppressive changes that everyone in the bar could feel crawling up their spines but couldn't name until it exploded in front of them. Because on this particular night, the dim red glow from the neon beer signs and the low rumble of classic rock couldn't mask the tension building around a young Latina waitress named Milena Rossi, who moved between the sticky wooden tables with the quiet grace of someone who'd learned to make herself small. Someone used to being dismissed with a wave, insulted under breath, treated like a shadow passing through other people's lives, though beneath her blue diner uniform and exhausted eyes lived a strength and a legacy that no one in that bar could begin to comprehend. And as the back office door crashed open and the bar manager David Jones stormed out with fury, twisting his reddened face like a man possessed, the atmosphere didn't just shift, it shattered, became something dangerous, electric, the kind of tension that makes strangers hold their breath and grip their glasses tighter. And Milena could feel the storm coming for her long before she heard David's voice cutting through the conversations like a serrated blade, accusing her of screwing up orders, talking back to customers, acting like she owned the place, forgetting her position, forgetting who was in charge here. Though Milena had only tried to explain calmly that the kitchen was backed up, that she was doing her best, that she'd apologized to every table, her voice steady even as David closed the distance between them with aggressive steps that made the floorboards groan, even as he jabbed his thick finger toward her face and sneered about people like her needing to learn respect, needing to understand that immigrant waitresses don't get attitudes in his bar. And when Milena's composure finally cracked and she said quietly, almost desperately, "My brother won't let you treat me like this," David's face contorted into something cruel and mocking as he threw his head back and laughed, a sound so venomous it made several patrons flinch in their seats. "What brother?" he spat, loud enough for everyone to hear, loud enough to humiliate her completely. "What mafia fantasy are you living in, sweetheart? You think anyone's coming to save you?" And before Milena could take a breath, before she could step back, before anyone in that frozen, watching crowd could process what was about to happen, David grabbed a fistful of her dark hair and slammed her face down onto the wooden bar counter with a sickening crack that silenced every conversation, stopped every breath, shattered every illusion that this was just another argument between staff. A woman at the bar gasped and covered her mouth with trembling hands. A man in a plaid flannel shirt froze mid-sip, beer halfway to his lips. Someone's glass hit the floor and shattered, and in that moment of horrified paralysis, as Milena cried out in pain, and David held her pinned against the bar like she was nothing, like she was nobody, not a single person moved to help her. Not the couple in the corner booth who looked away in shame, not the regular who'd been coming to this bar for 15 years, not even the young bartender who stood there with wide, terrified eyes but stayed rooted behind his station because everyone in Redwood Tavern had learned the same bitter lesson. You don't cross David Jones. You don't speak up. You watch, and you stay quiet, and you tell yourself it's not your problem. But what none of them understood, what David Jones was about to learn in the most terrifying way possible, was that Milena Rossi wasn't just a waitress. She wasn't just another invisible service worker to be abused and forgotten. She was the younger sister of Lionello Rossi, a name whispered in back rooms and dark alleys across 3 states, a man whose reputation made career criminals check over their shoulders, whose organization moved millions in the shadows, whose enforcers had disappeared people for far less than laying a hand on his blood. And Lionello Rossi wasn't on his way to the bar. He wasn't receiving a panicked phone call. He wasn't going to arrive too late, after the damage was done, because the tall, broad-shouldered man in the impeccably tailored black suit who'd been sitting quietly in the back corner booth for the past 20 minutes, the man with dark eyes that never stopped watching, with tattooed hands folded calmly on the table, with an aura of controlled violence that made strangers unconsciously give him space, that man was already here. And he had just watched David Jones assault his baby sister. The evening had started differently for Lionello Rossi. Started with the kind of quiet intention that defined how he moved through the world deliberately, carefully, always 3 steps ahead of everyone else in the room. He'd driven to Redwood Tavern alone, without his usual security detail, without the convoy of black SUVs that normally announced his presence like a funeral procession. Because tonight wasn't about business or territory, or the 1,000 moving pieces of his organization that demanded constant attention. Tonight was about the one person in his life who still believed he could be something other than Il Leone. The one person who looked at him and saw a brother before she saw a monster. Milena had insisted on working this job despite his protests, despite his offer to support her financially, to set her up with something safer, something that didn't require her to smile at drunk strangers and pretend their disrespect didn't cut deep. But she'd been adamant, told him she needed to build something of her own, to prove she could exist in the world without his shadow consuming everything she touched. And Lionello, who controlled an empire built on fear and blood, who could make men twice his size tremble with a single glance, found himself powerless against his baby sister's determination to live a normal life. So he'd compromised in the only way he knew how. He came to check on her when she didn't know he was watching, slipped into Redwood Tavern during her shifts, and positioned himself in the darkest corner booth where the neon light barely reached, where he could observe without being observed, where he could catalog every interaction, every customer who spoke to her, every moment that might signal danger. The staff had learned not to bother him. I learned that the man in the expensive suit who nursed a single whiskey for hours and never looked at his phone wanted to be left alone. They assumed he was meeting someone, conducting business, hiding from a wife or a warrant. They never imagined the truth. That he was there for Milena. That he'd been watching over her like this for weeks. That every protective instinct he possessed, every territorial impulse that made him dangerous, was focused entirely on making sure his sister stayed safe in a world that had proven itself cruel to people like them. And tonight, as Lionello sat in his usual spot with his back to the wall, and his eyes tracking Milena's movements between tables, he'd felt it building. That particular quality of tension he'd learned to recognize in prison yards and back-alley negotiations, the electricity that precedes violence. He'd watched David Jones emerge from the back office with that specific energy, the swagger of a small man drunk on small power, looking for someone weaker to dominate. And Lionello's jaw had tightened as he watched David's attention lock onto Milena like a predator selecting prey. His hand had moved instinctively to his phone, ready to intervene before things escalated, ready to make a call that would have David Jones fired and blacklisted from every establishment in the region within the hour. But he'd hesitated, remembering Milena's words from their last argument about her independence, her fierce insistence that she didn't need him to solve her problems, that his protection was suffocating her, preventing her from learning to navigate the world on her own terms. So Lionello had forced himself to wait, to watch, to let his sister handle her own battles even though every instinct screamed at him to crush the threat before it materialized. He'd remained seated as David approached Milena, as the manager's voice rose in volume and aggression, as other customers began noticing the confrontation. His fingers had drummed against the table in a steady rhythm that betrayed none of the violence coiling inside him. The careful control he maintained over the beast that lived beneath his expensive suits and calculated calm. But then David had touched her, had grabbed Milena's hair with casual brutality, and slammed her face against the bar counter with a sound that would echo in Lionello's nightmares for years to come. And in that instant, every promise he'd made to let Milena live independently, every compromise he'd negotiated with himself about staying in the shadows, every restraint he'd carefully constructed to separate his sister's world from his own, all of it disintegrated like paper in a furnace. Lionello rose from his seat, with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent his life preparing for moments exactly like this, who understood violence not as chaos but as choreography, who could calculate the exact amount of force required to send a message that would be remembered for generations. The whiskey glass remained on the table, abandoned. His phone stayed in his pocket. His hands hung loose at his sides, deceptively relaxed, though anyone who understood body language would have recognized the coiled potential in his posture, the particular stillness of an apex predator about to strike. The other patrons felt the shift immediately, felt it in the same instinctive way prey animals sense a wolf entering the clearing. Conversations died mid-sentence. Eyes tracked the tall figure in the black suit as he moved through the bar, with purposeful steps that seemed to make the floorboards groan under the weight of something far heavier than physical mass. And David Jones, still holding Milena pinned against the counter, still riding the high of his own petty tyranny, remained oblivious to the danger approaching from behind until Lionello's voice cut through the silence like a blade drawn from its sheath. "Let her go." 2 words. Spoken quietly, almost conversationally, without anger or threat or any of the theatrical aggression that small men mistake for power. Just a simple statement delivered in a tone that made every person in Redwood Tavern understand with absolute certainty that they were witnessing something that would change the course of this night, this bar, and quite possibly the rest of their lives. The silence that followed Lionello's command was absolute, the kind of silence that precedes earthquakes and tornadoes, when nature itself seems to hold its breath before unleashing devastation. David's grip on Melena's hair slackened slightly, some primitive part of his brain registering danger even before his conscious mind could process the voice that had spoken from behind him, that quiet authority that carried more weight than any scream could have delivered. And Melena, still pressed against the bar counter with tears streaming down her bruised face, felt her brother's presence like a physical force, like the moment before lightning strikes when the air becomes charged with electricity and everything metal begins to hum. She'd begged him not to come to the bar anymore, told him his presence made things complicated, made her coworkers nervous, made customers whisper and speculate about the well-dressed man who watched her from the shadows. But now, with pain radiating through her skull and blood trickling from her nose, with the taste of humiliation sharp and bitter on her tongue, Melena had never been more grateful for her brother's protective obsession, his inability to trust the world to treat her with the kindness she deserved. David turned slowly, his hand still tangled in Melena's dark hair, though his attention had shifted completely to the man standing behind him, and for the first time that night, genuine uncertainty flickered across his flushed features. Because the stranger in the black suit didn't look like the typical Redwood Tavern customer, didn't have the worn jeans and construction boots of the regulars, didn't carry himself with the defeated slouch of men who came here to forget their failures. This man stood like he owned not just the bar, but the very ground beneath it. Stood with the kind of confidence that came from never having to prove anything because everyone already knew. "I said let her go," Lionello repeated, taking another step forward, and this time David released Melena completely, his hand dropping to his side as if her hair had suddenly become hot to the touch. Melena stumbled back from the bar, one hand pressed to her bleeding nose, her eyes locked on her brother's face with an expression that mixed relief and fear and something deeper, something that understood this moment, would shatter the careful separation she'd tried to maintain between her two worlds. "Who the hell are you?" David demanded, trying to inject authority back into his voice, trying to reclaim the power that had drained from him the moment this stranger appeared. He puffed out his chest, squared his shoulders, attempted to use his size advantage to intimidate, because size was the only advantage David had ever understood, the only language of power his limited imagination could speak. "This is my bar, and this is staff discipline. You need to mind your own business and sit back down before I have you thrown out." Lionello didn't respond immediately, didn't rise to the bait or engage with David's posturing, because men like David Jones had been trying to intimidate him since childhood, since the group homes and juvenile facilities where he'd learned that real power had nothing to do with volume or physical size but with the willingness to do what others couldn't stomach. Instead, Lionello's gaze moved past David to his sister, conducted a silent assessment of her injuries, the blood on her face, the redness where her cheek had impacted the counter, the fear and shame swimming in her dark eyes, and something shifted in his expression, something that made the temperature in Redwood Tavern drop 10 degrees. "Your bar," Lionello said quietly, finally returning his attention to David, and there was something almost curious in his tone, as if he were examining an interesting insect before deciding whether to crush it or preserve it in amber. "You believe you have authority here. You believe you can put your hands on service workers without consequences. You believe the world operates according to rules that protect men like you." David's face reddened further, confusion mixing with his anger, because this stranger was speaking to him like a teacher addressing a particularly slow student, was using that measured tone that somehow felt more insulting than any shouted threat could have been. "I don't know who you think you are, but you need to leave. Now. Before I call the cops and have you arrested for trespassing." "Cops," Lionello repeated, and something that might have been amusement flickered across his features, though his eyes remained cold, calculating, already running through scenarios and outcomes with the strategic precision that had built his empire. "Yes, please call them. I'm certain they'd be very interested in the assault I just witnessed. The assault that at least a dozen patrons also witnessed." His gaze swept across the bar, touching briefly on each frozen customer, each person who'd been too afraid to intervene but would now serve as witnesses to what came next. "That woman at the bar has been recording on her phone for the past 5 minutes. The man in the plaid shirt looks like he wants to say something. And I'm curious. David Jones, is that your name, correct? I'm curious whether your employer knows you have a habit of assaulting employees." David's face drained of color at the casual use of his name, At the realization that this stranger knew exactly who he was, which suggested a level of premeditation that made David's earlier confidence evaporate like morning dew under a blowtorch. Who are you? Lionello took another step forward. Close enough now that David had to tilt his head back slightly to maintain eye contact. Close enough that the size advantage David had relied on suddenly meant nothing because size was irrelevant when facing someone who radiated the kind of danger that couldn't be measured in inches or pounds. I'm the brother she warned you about, Lionello said, his voice dropping even lower, becoming intimate, almost gentle, which somehow made it infinitely more terrifying. I'm the Mafia fantasy you were laughing about 30 seconds ago. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, and David Jones felt his bladder threaten to betray him as the full weight of his mistake crashed down on his shoulders like a collapsing building. Because somewhere in the fog of alcohol and misplaced authority that had governed his actions tonight, somewhere beneath the arrogance that came from years of bullying people who couldn't fight back, a memory stirred, fragments of conversations overheard in darker corners of darker bars, whispers about a man named Rossi, who controlled everything from the docks to the construction sites, whose organization moved through the city like a shadow government, whose family was untouchable in ways that made the official law enforcement look like children playing dress-up. Rossi, David whispered, the name scraping out of his throat like broken glass, and he took an involuntary step backward, his body understanding what his mind was still struggling to accept. No, that's not possible. She's just a waitress. She's nobody. She can't be. She's my sister, Lionello interrupted, and there was something almost tender in the way he said it. A softness that contrasted sharply with the absolute menace radiating from his posture. Her name is Milena Rossi. She's 23 years old. She graduated top of her class despite working 2 jobs to support herself because she refused to take my money. She likes reading mystery novels and listening to jazz music that I personally find unbearable. She makes the best carbonara I've ever tasted, and you just slammed her face into a bar counter because she had the audacity to speak back to you. Each word landed like a physical blow, and David found himself unable to look away from Lionello's eyes. Those dark, calculating eyes that seemed to be cataloging every twitch, every bead of sweat forming on David's forehead, every microscopic indicator of the terror that was flooding through his system like poison. Around them, the other patrons remained frozen, some with phones now openly recording, others simply staring in horrified fascination at the confrontation unfolding before them, like watching a nature documentary where the gazelle finally realizes the lion has been stalking it for miles. I didn't know, David stammered, hating the weakness in his voice but unable to control it, unable to summon any of the bluster that usually served him so well when dealing with people who lacked the power to destroy him. If I'd known who she was, I never would have. She never said anything. She never told anyone. She shouldn't have needed to, Lionello said, his voice still quiet, still controlled, though something dangerous flickered behind his eyes like lightning inside storm clouds. The fact that she's my sister shouldn't be the only thing protecting her from assault. The fact that she's a human being should have been enough. But clearly, you're the kind of man who only understands power when it's backed by the threat of violence. So let me speak to you in a language you'll comprehend. Lionello moved closer still, invading David's personal space, with the casual confidence of someone who'd never worried about physical confrontation, who understood that real combat started and ended in the mind long before fists ever flew. I know where you live, David. I know you rent that apartment on Maple Street, 3rd floor, the one with the broken lock on the back door that you keep meaning to fix. I know you drive a blue Ford pickup with a dent in the passenger side. I know you have a mother in a nursing home in Pinewood who you visit every other Sunday, though you've been skipping recently because you'd rather spend the money on whiskey and poker games. I know about your gambling debts, about the 2 DUIs you somehow managed to avoid jail time for, about the ex-wife who fled to Colorado to get away from you. With each revelation, David's face grew paler. His legs began to tremble, and the realization that Lionello Rossi had been watching, researching, knowing settled over him like a burial shroud. The bar's other patrons exchanged horrified glances, understanding that they were witnessing not just a confrontation but a systematic dismantling of a man's entire existence, watching someone discover that his privacy, his security, his very life had been an illusion all along. Please, David whispered, and the word came out broken, desperate, stripped of all the authority he'd wielded just minutes ago when he'd been the one with power, the one who decided who got humiliated and who got protected. Please, I'm sorry. I didn't mean I was just having a bad day. I wasn't thinking. You meant it, Lionello corrected, still speaking in that quiet, terrible voice that made every word feel like a knife sliding between ribs. You meant every second of it. You enjoyed it. You've been enjoying it for months, haven't you? Making her life miserable, making her feel small, using your position to abuse someone who couldn't fight back without losing the income she needs to survive. He paused, letting the words sink in, letting David feel the full weight of his actions reflected back at him. And now you're going to learn what happens when you hurt someone I love. Milena, still standing near the bar with her hand pressed to her bleeding nose, felt tears streaming down her face for entirely different reasons now. I felt the complicated swirl of emotions that came from watching her brother, the man she'd spent years trying to separate from his reputation, trying to see as just family rather than the criminal empire he represented, transform into Il Leone right before her eyes. Part of her wanted to tell him to stop, to show mercy, to prove that he could be better than the violence that defined him. But another part, the part that still felt David's hand in her hair, still tasted blood and humiliation, wanted to watch her brother tear this place apart. "Lionello," she said softly, and her brother's attention shifted to her immediately, his expression softening fractionally, though the danger never left his posture. "Did he hurt you, little one?" Lionello asked in Italian, the language of their childhood, the private code they'd developed to speak without being understood. Milena nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Lionello turned back to David, and his smile was the most frightening thing anyone in Redwood Tavern had ever seen. The transformation was complete, and everyone in Redwood Tavern could feel it the way power had shifted from David Jones to Lionello Rossi as decisively as a throne changing hands, as absolute as the tide turning. David stood there trembling, reduced from tyrant to victim in the span of minutes, while Lionello moved past him with deliberate slowness, each step a reminder that he could have crossed that distance in an instant, but chose not to. Chose to let David marinate in his terror, chose to make this moment last because lessons delivered too quickly were lessons forgotten too easily. Lionello reached Milena and his entire demeanor shifted, the predator receding just enough to let the brother surface, though the danger never fully disappeared, remained coiled beneath his careful movements like a serpent ready to strike. He lifted her chin gently with tattooed fingers that had signed death warrants and closed million-dollar deals, examining the damage with the meticulous attention he applied to everything that mattered to him, cataloging the swelling that had already begun around her cheekbone, the blood still trickling from her nose, the fingerprint-shaped bruises forming where David's grip had been cruelest. "Let me see," he said softly in Italian, pulling a pristine white handkerchief from his jacket pocket and dabbing carefully at the blood on her face, his touch so gentle it made Milena's chest tighten with emotions she couldn't name. "Is your vision blurred? Do you feel dizzy? Any ringing in your ears?" "I'm okay," Milena whispered back in the same language, though they both knew it was a lie, knew that the real damage wouldn't be visible for days or weeks, would manifest in nightmares and flinching at sudden movements, and the particular shame that came from being victimized in public while people watched and did nothing. "Lionello, please, just take me home. I don't want—" "Did he hurt you before tonight?" Lionello interrupted, his eyes never leaving her face, reading the truth in her expression before she could formulate an answer. "How long has this been happening, Milena? How long have you been protecting him from me?" The question landed like an accusation, and Milena felt fresh tears spilling down her cheeks because her brother understood her too well, knew that she'd been hiding David's verbal abuse for weeks, had been making excuses and telling herself it wasn't that bad, that she could handle it, that calling Lionello would only prove she couldn't survive in the normal world without his intervention. It was just words before, she admitted quietly, her voice breaking. Just him being mean, being a boss who didn't like me. I never thought he'd actually— "Words matter," Lionello said, his jaw tightening as fury and grief warred across his features. "Words that diminish you, that make you feel worthless, that chip away at your confidence day after day. Those are violence too, little one. And you should have told me. You should have let me handle this before it escalated to—" He stopped himself, took a breath, forced his anger back under control because directing it at Milena would only add to her pain, would only make her retreat further into the independence that kept putting her in danger. Behind them, David remained frozen in place, watching this exchange in Italian that he couldn't understand but whose emotional content was unmistakable, and the reality of his situation continued sinking deeper into his consciousness. Because Lionello Rossi wasn't just angry, he was calculating, planning, deciding David's fate with the same methodical precision he applied to all his business dealings, and the fact that Lionello had taken time to care for his sister first, to ensure she was stable before dealing with her attacker, somehow made him more terrifying rather than less. The other patrons had their phones out now, no longer trying to hide the fact they were recording, because the initial shock had worn off enough for survival instinct to kick in. The understanding that documenting this moment might be the only insurance policy they had if Lionello decided witnesses were liabilities. The woman at the bar who'd gasped earlier was openly crying, her hands shaking as she held her phone steady. The man in the plaid flannel shirt had moved closer to the exit, positioning himself for a quick escape if things turned violent. Even the bartender had abandoned any pretense of working, stood there staring with wide eyes that reflected the neon beer signs like warning lights. "Please," David tried again, his voice cracking under the weight of desperation that had replaced his earlier arrogance. "Please, Mr. Rossi, I'm begging you. I have a family. I have people who depend on me. I made a mistake, a terrible mistake, but I can make it right. I can apologize. I can pay for medical bills. You can be quiet," Lionello said without turning around, still focused on Milena, still dabbing blood from her face with movements so tender they seemed to belong to a different person entirely from the man who'd been cataloging David's life details minutes earlier. "You'll speak when I tell you to speak. You'll move when I tell you to move. You'll breathe when I tell you to breathe. Because right now, David Jones, your life belongs to me, and whether you walk out of this bar or get carried out in pieces depends entirely on whether you can follow simple instructions." The threat wasn't delivered with theatrical menace or raised voices, was spoken in the same conversational tone Lionello might use to discuss the weather, which somehow made it infinitely more credible, because men who shout their threats are often bluffing, are trying to convince themselves as much as their victims. But men who speak quietly, who treat violence as a simple matter of logistics rather than emotion, those men follow through. "My phone," Lionello said, extending his hand without looking away from Milena. And one of the customers, a nervous man in a business suit, who'd been sitting 3 tables away, immediately pulled out Lionello's phone from where it had been left on the corner booth table and placed it in his palm like a sacred bay offering. Lionello nodded his thanks, then dialed a number from memory while keeping one arm around Milena's shoulders, supporting her weight as exhaustion and shock finally began catching up to her adrenaline. "Vincent," Lionello said when the call connected, his voice still calm, still measured, carrying none of the urgency that would have characterized a normal emergency call. "I need you at Redwood Tavern. Bring the crew. We have a situation that requires immediate attention." The 10 minutes that followed Vincent's summons felt like hours inside Redwood Tavern, time stretching and warping under the weight of tension so thick it seemed to press against everyone's lungs, making breathing difficult, making thought nearly impossible. Lionello had guided Milena to his corner booth, settling her carefully against the worn leather seat while he remained standing, positioning himself between her and the rest of the bar like a human shield, like a sentry guarding something precious from a world that had proven itself unworthy of gentleness. David hadn't moved from his spot near the bar counter, hadn't dared to shift his weight or clear his throat or do anything that might draw Lionello's attention back to him before whatever was coming finally arrived. Sweat soaked through his shirt despite the bar's cool temperature, and his hands trembled so violently that he pressed them against his thighs to hide the visible evidence of his terror. Around him, the other patrons remained frozen in their own private calculations, weighing the risk of trying to leave against the risk of staying, wondering whether being present for what came next made them witnesses or accomplices. "Does anyone need to leave?" Lionello asked suddenly, his voice carrying easily across the silent bar. And the question sounded almost polite, almost considerate, except for the implication buried beneath it that leaving would be noted, remembered, potentially interpreted as disloyalty or disrespect. "If you have somewhere to be, somewhere more important than ensuring justice gets served tonight, now would be the time to go." Nobody moved. The woman at the bar who'd been crying earlier shook her head emphatically, clutching her phone like a lifeline. The man in the plaid flannel shirt who'd positioned himself near the exit took 2 deliberate steps back toward his table, making clear his intention to stay. Even the bartender, young and obviously terrified, remained at his post as if nailed to the floor. "Good," Lionello said, and something that might have been approval flickered across his features. Because what David Jones did tonight, assaulting a service worker, brutalizing someone who couldn't fight back, using his authority to terrorize someone under his supervision, that requires witnesses. That requires people who'll remember and tell others what happens when you hurt someone a Rossi loves. He turned slightly, checking on Milena, who sat hunched in the booth with the blood-stained handkerchief pressed to her face, her eyes tracking her brother's movements with an expression that mixed gratitude and guilt, and a deep, aching sadness that came from watching the life she'd tried to build separate from his world collapse like a house of cards. She'd wanted so badly to prove she could exist outside his protection, could make her own way without the Rossi name opening doors or closing throats, but tonight had shattered that illusion as completely as David had shattered her sense of safety. "I'm sorry," she whispered in Italian. Though whether she was apologizing for not telling him about David's abuse earlier, or for dragging him into this situation, or simply for existing in a way that required his constant vigilance, even she wasn't certain. "You have nothing to be sorry for," Lionello responded in the same language, his tone brooking no argument. "Nothing. The shame belongs to him, to everyone who watched him mistreat you and said nothing, to a world that taught men like David Jones that power means the freedom to hurt people weaker than themselves. But not to you, little one. Never to you." The sound of vehicles pulling up outside interrupted their exchange, 3 black SUVs arriving in formation, parking with military precision that suggested the drivers had practiced this exact maneuver countless times. Doors opened and closed with synchronized efficiency, and footsteps approached the tavern entrance with purposeful cadence that made David's knees buckle slightly, made him grab the bar counter for support as his worst fears materialized into physical reality. Vincent Caruso entered first, a wall of muscle in an expensive suit, followed by 4 other men who moved with the casual confidence of people comfortable with violence, who scanned the bar with professional assessment, cataloging exits and potential threats and the positions of every person present. Their presence transformed Redwood Tavern from a roadside dive into something else entirely: a courtroom, a tribunal, a place where unofficial justice would be administered according to rules far older than any legal system. "Boss," Vincent said, his voice respectful but not subservient, acknowledging Lionello's authority while maintaining the dignity of someone who'd earned his position through competence rather than nepotism. His gaze flickered briefly to Milena, and something dark passed across his features. Vincent had known her since she was 15, had taught her to drive, had been the one to walk her to her first day of high school when Lionello was serving his second stint in juvenile detention. "What do you need?" "Lock it down," Lionello said simply. "Nobody leaves until I say otherwise. And someone get my sister some ice for her face. Real ice, not the half-melted trash from behind that bar." One of Vincent's men moved immediately toward the entrance, flipping the tavern's sign to closed and positioning himself in front of the door like a human barricade. Another disappeared toward the back, presumably to secure any secondary exits. A third approached with a clean towel wrapped around ice from what must have been a cooler in one of the SUVs, offering it to Milena with a gentleness that seemed incongruous with his scarred knuckles and dead eyes. "Thank you, Tommy," Milena said quietly, accepting the ice and pressing it carefully to her swelling cheek, and the fact that she knew his name, that she treated these dangerous men with the same courtesy she'd shown the bar's customers, seemed to affect them in ways that threats never could, made them stand a little straighter, made their expressions harden with protective fury. "Which one did this?" Vincent asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. Suggested he'd identified David Jones the moment he'd walked through the door, based purely on the guilty terror radiating from him like heat from a furnace. "The manager," Lionello confirmed. "The one who looks like he's about to vomit." David Jones. Age 37. No significant criminal record, which is about to change dramatically. Vincent approached David with the measured steps of a man who'd conducted interrogations in places where screaming went unheard, where confessions were extracted not through physical torture, but through the psychological dismantling of whatever fragile courage a person possessed. He stopped just close enough that David could smell his cologne expensive, tasteful, the kind of detail that reminded everyone present that Lionello's organization wasn't some crude street gang, but a sophisticated operation that moved through legitimate and illegitimate worlds with equal fluency. "Tell me what happened," Vincent said, his voice carrying none of Lionello's quiet menace but instead projecting a business-like efficiency that was somehow worse, that suggested this was merely a procedure to be completed, a formality before predetermined consequences were delivered. "From your perspective, I want to hear you explain what led to you putting your hands on Miss Rossi." David's mouth opened and closed several times before sound emerged, his brain struggling to formulate words that might somehow mitigate his situation, might paint his actions in a light that wouldn't result in him disappearing into the night. There were complaints from customers about her service, and when I tried to address it professionally, she got defensive, started talking about her brother like it was some kind of threat, and I reacted poorly. I lost my temper. It was a moment of bad judgment, but I never meant to actually hurt her. I just wanted to." "Stop," Lionello interrupted from across the bar, still standing protectively near Milena's booth, and his single word carried more authority than David's entire explanation. "Vincent asked what happened, not what fantasy you've constructed to justify assault. Try again, and this time, Tell the truth. Because every person in this bar witnessed what you did, and several of them recorded it. The reminder that evidence existed, that David's version of events could be immediately contradicted by video footage, drained what little color remained in his face. His legs finally gave out completely, and he slumped against the bar counter, no longer even attempting to maintain the posture of authority he'd wielded so confidently when Milena had been his target. I grabbed her hair, David whispered, the words scraping out of his throat like broken glass. I slammed her face into the bar. I was angry because she'd been. She talks back sometimes, doesn't show proper respect, and I'd had a bad day. And when she mentioned her brother, it felt like she was trying to intimidate me, trying to use connections to avoid accountability, and I snapped. I wanted to teach her a lesson about knowing her place. The confession hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, and Vincent nodded slowly as if David had just confirmed something he'd already known, had just validated an assessment he'd made the moment he'd walked through the door. He pulled out his phone, tapped the screen several times, then turned it around to show David the video that the woman at the bar had uploaded to a private cloud storage footage showing the entire assault in brutal clarity, showing David's grip tightening in Milena's hair, showing the vicious downward motion, showing her face impacting the counter, showing her crying out in pain while customers froze in horror. That lesson you wanted to teach, Vincent said conversationally, pocketing his phone again. It's interesting how education works, isn't it? Because tonight you're the one getting schooled. You're learning that actions have consequences, that the world doesn't actually protect men like you the way you thought it did, that sometimes the invisible waitress you brutalize turns out to be connected to people who can make you understand exactly what it feels like to be powerless. David started crying then. Not the quiet tears of genuine remorse, but the ugly, desperate sobbing of someone who'd finally grasped the magnitude of their mistake, who understood that no amount of apology would rewind time, would undo the moment his hand had tangled in Milena's hair. Please, he begged, addressing the room at large since he no longer knew who held his fate. Please, I have a mother who needs me. I have bills to pay. I have a life. I can't just please don't kill me. I'll do anything. I'll leave town. I'll never come back. I'll kill you? Lionello's voice carried genuine curiosity, as if the suggestion hadn't occurred to him, as if death was too simple a solution for the problem David represented. That would be mercy, David. That would be quick. But you assaulted my sister in front of witnesses. Filmed evidence exists of your crime, and you've just confessed to doing it deliberately, to wanting to teach her a lesson about her place in your hierarchy. So no, death isn't what you're getting tonight. He moved closer now, crossing the distance between Milena's booth and the bar with measured steps that made David shrink back against the counter as if he could somehow phase through the wood and disappear. What you're getting is education. Real education. The kind that ensures you never forget what happens when you hurt someone who matters to people more powerful than you could imagine. Lionello gestured to Vincent, who produced a tablet from inside his jacket and handed it to his boss with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd participated in this exact routine before. Lionello tapped the screen, pulling up files, documents, information that made David's eyes widen with fresh horror as he recognized bank statements, photographs, personal correspondence, the accumulated evidence of Lionello's surveillance, proof that his life had been transparent to the Rossi organization long before tonight's assault. You're going to confess, Lionello said, holding up the tablet so David could see himself on the screen. The camera was already recording, had been recording since Vincent arrived. You're going to admit to every instance of workplace abuse you've committed, every inappropriate comment, every time you used your authority to terrorize employees who couldn't fight back. You're going to name other victims, provide dates and details, make yourself completely unemployable in any management position for the rest of your miserable life, and you're going to do it willingly, enthusiastically even, because the alternative is that Vincent and his colleagues demonstrate what real physical persuasion looks like. David looked between Lionello and Vincent, between the tablet recording his image and the enforcer who stood ready to make good on any threat, and whatever resistance he might have contemplated evaporated like morning dew. Okay, he whispered. Okay, I'll tell you everything. David's confession took 43 minutes to complete, and every second was captured in high definition on Vincent's tablet. 43 minutes of a man systematically dismantling his own life, admitting to patterns of abuse that stretched back years, naming other victims who'd been too afraid to speak up, describing incidents that transformed from isolated moments of poor judgment into a documented pattern of predatory behavior. He spoke haltingly at first, requiring prompting from Vincent, but as the confession progressed, and the reality of his situation fully penetrated his consciousness, The words began flowing more freely, almost compulsively, as if some dam inside him had finally broken under the pressure of accumulated guilt and terror. He admitted to harassing the previous waitress until she quit without notice, admitted to making inappropriate comments about female employees' appearances, admitted to creating a hostile work environment where staff learned quickly that complaining only made things worse. He described using his position to demand sexual favors from a bartender who'd needed the job desperately enough to comply for 3 months before finally breaking down and leaving town. He confessed to stealing from the tip jar and blaming it on employees, to doctoring time cards to short paychecks, to a dozen other abuses of power that painted a portrait of systematic cruelty enabled by a system that protected managers over workers. The other patrons watched in stunned silence, several of them recording on their own phones now that the precedent had been established, documenting not just David's confession but the entire transformation of Redwood Tavern into an impromptu court where justice operated according to rules that had nothing to do with legal procedure and everything to do with raw power dynamics. The woman at the bar who'd been crying earlier had stopped, her tears replaced by something harder, something that looked like satisfaction as she watched a man who'd probably harassed her friends or family finally face consequences that the official system would never have delivered. When David finally finished, his voice hoarse from talking, his face wet with tears and sweat, Lionello reviewed the footage with meticulous attention, occasionally scrolling back to verify details, ensuring the confession was comprehensive enough to serve its purpose. He nodded once, satisfied, then handed the tablet back to Vincent with instructions delivered in Italian that made Vincent smile, not a pleasant smile, but the expression of a craftsman who'd just been given an interesting project. "What happens now?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper, and the question carried the weight of a man standing at the edge of an abyss trying to determine how far the fall would be. "Now," Lionello said, settling back into the booth next to Milena, who'd been watching the entire confession with an expression that mixed vindication and sadness. "Now your confession goes public. Not to the police, they're useless, corrupt, more interested in protecting businesses than workers. No, this goes somewhere far more effective. This goes to the internet, where it lives forever, where every potential employer will find it, where everyone who searches your name will discover exactly what kind of man you are." The implications crashed over David like a tidal wave. A criminal conviction could eventually be expunged, could be explained away as youthful mistakes or extenuating circumstances, could potentially be overcome with time and legal maneuvering. But internet infamy was permanent, was searchable, was the kind of scarlet letter that followed someone through every job application, every apartment rental, every attempt to rebuild a life in a world where digital records never truly disappeared. "Within an hour," Vincent added, his tone almost cheerful as he outlined David's digital execution. "This video will be on Reddit, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, every social media platform where people gather to witness public shamings. Within 3 hours, news outlets will pick it up because assault confessions generate clicks and advertising revenue. Within 6 hours, your name will be trending. Think pieces will be written about toxic workplace culture, and every person you've ever known will be sending you messages asking if it's really you in the video. Within 24 hours, you'll be the most hated man on the internet, and that distinction never really goes away, David. It just becomes part of your permanent identity." David's face drained of what little color remained, and he actually swayed on his feet, grabbing the bar counter for support as the full scope of his destruction became clear. This wasn't just about losing his job at Redwood Tavern. This was about losing any chance at normalcy, at anonymity, at the comfortable obscurity that allowed people to move through the world without constant recognition and judgment. "Please," he tried one more time, though even he seemed to understand the futility of appealing to mercy from people he'd proven himself incapable of showing mercy toward. "Please, there has to be another way. Community service, financial restitution. I'll pay Milena whatever she wants. Money." Milena spoke for the first time since her confession had begun, her voice stronger than expected despite the bruising on her face, despite the exhaustion that radiated from her posture. "You think money fixes what you did? You think a check makes up for months of feeling worthless, of dreading coming to work, of having customers watch you get berated and doing nothing because they were afraid of you too?" She stood up from the booth, ignoring Lionello's protective gesture, moving toward David with steady steps that made him flinch backward. "I don't want your money, David. I want you to feel exactly what you made me feel: powerless, exposed, humiliated in front of people who won't help because helping costs too much. I want you to know what it's like when your entire life can be destroyed by someone more powerful than you, when nobody cares about your explanations or your excuses because you're not worth protecting. The words landed with devastating accuracy, and David actually flinched as if she'd struck him, because Milena had articulated the exact nature of his punishment, not physical pain, but the psychological torture of complete social annihilation, of becoming a pariah whose presence made people uncomfortable, whose history preceded him into every interaction. "Upload it," Lionello said to Vincent, and the command was delivered with such finality that several patrons gasped, understanding that they were witnessing the point of no return, the moment when David Jones's life as he knew it ended permanently. All of it. The assault footage, the confession, everything. And make sure to tag it properly: workplace abuse, assault, confession, justice. Let the algorithm do what the legal system won't. Vincent's fingers moved across his phone screen with practiced efficiency, and within seconds, the first upload notification appeared. Then another. Then another. The video spreading across digital platforms like a virus, like wildfire, unstoppable, and exponentially multiplicative. Within minutes, the view counter began climbing hundreds, then thousands, then tens of thousands. As people discovered the content and shared it with their own networks, each share adding momentum to David's public destruction. The woman at the bar who'd recorded the original assault checked her own phone and let out a small gasp. "It's already trending," she said, her voice carrying across the silent tavern. "Number 3 on Twitter. People are identifying the bar, identifying him. Someone already posted his home address and phone number." "Doxing," Vincent said with satisfaction. "The internet's immune system identifying a threat and mobilizing to neutralize it. Beautiful. Really. How crowdsourced justice works when you give people enough information." David collapsed completely then, sliding down the bar counter until he sat on the floor with his back against the wood. His career destroyed, his reputation annihilated, his future reduced to whatever existence someone could cobble together when the entire world knew the worst thing they'd ever done. He didn't cry anymore, had moved beyond tears into a kind of shocked numbness that suggested his brain had simply overloaded, had shut down non-essential functions to preserve whatever psychological core might survive this devastation. Lionello watched him for a long moment, his expression unreadable, then turned his attention back to Milena. "How do you feel?" he asked in Italian. And the question carried layers of meaning, not just about her physical injuries, but about witnessing this level of retribution delivered on her behalf, about watching her brother transform into the criminal everyone whispered about in the darker corners of the city. "Tired," Milena admitted, leaning against him the way she had when she was small and the world felt too big and frightening. "Tired and sad and angry and relieved and guilty all at once. Is that normal?" "Very normal," Lionello assured her, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "You're allowed to feel complicated things about complicated situations. You're allowed to be glad he's facing consequences while also wishing the world was different enough that consequences weren't necessary." The bar remained locked for another hour, while Vincent's team conducted what they called exit interviews, with each patron, not interrogations exactly, but careful conversations that ensured everyone understood the evening's events, understood what they'd witnessed, and what they'd be expected to say if anyone asked. Most people nodded eagerly, relieved to be treated as witnesses rather than problems, grateful for the implicit protection that came from being on Lionello Rossi's side of a conflict. A few seemed genuinely moved by what they'd seen, approached Milena directly to apologize for their earlier inaction, to express shame at having watched her suffer without intervening. "I'm sorry," said the man in the plaid flannel shirt, his voice thick with emotion that seemed authentic rather than performative. "I've been coming here for 3 years. I've seen him treat you badly before. And I never said anything because I told myself it wasn't my business, that you probably didn't want some random customer making things worse for you. But that was cowardice dressed up as consideration, and I'm ashamed of it." Milena accepted his apology with more grace than he deserved, thanked him for at least having the courage to acknowledge his failure, and the exchange seemed to lift something from both of them, a small moment of genuine human connection amid the night's broader violence and retribution. Other patrons followed his example, creating an impromptu confession session that had nothing to do with Lionello's enforcement, and everything to do with ordinary people confronting their own complicity in systems that enabled abuse. But while these smaller reconciliations happened around the periphery, the main event remained focused on David Jones, who still sat crumpled against the bar counter, watching his phone light up with notifications as the video continued spreading across the internet. As his digital execution progressed with mechanical efficiency, his face had taken on a grayish pallor, and his hands shook so violently that he could barely hold the phone, but he seemed unable to stop checking it, unable to look away from the real-time documentation of his social annihilation. "David," Lionello said, pulling the broken man's attention away from his screen, and there was something almost gentle in his tone now, the way a doctor might speak to a terminal patient when delivering final prognosis. "Look at me." David's eyes lifted slowly, reluctantly, meeting Lionello's gaze with the haunted expression of someone who'd passed beyond fear into a kind of numb acceptance. He no longer bothered pleading or negotiating because some part of him understood that the conversation had moved past the possibility of mercy into something else entirely, into the realm of lessons that needed to be delivered, completely, thoroughly, unforgettably. "I'm going to give you a choice," Lionello continued, settling into the bar stool across from where David sat slumped on the floor, the physical positioning creating a tableau that resembled a king addressing a defeated enemy. "Not because you deserve choices, but because I want you to understand that what happens next is something you participate in, something you consent to, so you can never claim you were simply a victim of circumstances beyond your control." David nodded mutely, incapable of speech, capable only of listening as Lionello outlined the options that would determine what remained of his future. "Option 1, Lionello said, holding up a single finger. "You leave this bar tonight and attempt to rebuild your life however you can manage, given that your confession is now permanently archived on the internet. You move to a different city, change your name if you're clever enough to navigate that process, take whatever menial work you can find that doesn't require background checks or reference calls. You spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder, wondering if someone recognizes you, wondering if your past has finally caught up with you again. And you live with the knowledge that if you ever put your hands on another service worker, another employee, another human being who can't fight back, I will find out. And what happened tonight will seem merciful compared to what comes next." He paused, letting that sink in, letting David contemplate a future defined entirely by fear and paranoia, and the constant weight of his documented sins following him through every interaction. "Option 2, Lionello continued, holding up a second finger. "You become useful to me. You work off your debt, not in money, but in service. You become an advocate for workplace abuse victims. You speak publicly about what you did and why it was wrong. You use your infamy to actually accomplish something meaningful. Vincent will supervise you, will ensure you're genuinely committed to rehabilitation, rather than just performing for cameras. And if you prove yourself capable of actual change, of genuine remorse, that translates into action rather than just words, then maybe in 5 or 10 years, you get to be a person again instead of just a cautionary tale." The second option hung in the air like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man, except this lifeline came with barbs and hooks, came with the understanding that accepting it meant surrendering autonomy completely, meant becoming an instrument of Lionello's will in ways that would be only marginally less destructive than option 1. "Or," Lionello said, his voice dropping lower, becoming quieter and somehow infinitely more dangerous. "Option 3. You refuse both previous options because you're stupid enough to believe you can fight this, can hire a lawyer, can somehow spin the narrative to make yourself sympathetic. And if you choose option 3, David, then I stop being reasonable. I stop offering you paths forward. And you discover what happens when someone with my resources decides to make your suffering a personal project rather than just a public lesson." David's phone buzzed insistently, with new notifications. The video had now crossed 1 million views, had been picked up by major news outlets, had spawned dozens of think pieces about workplace culture and power dynamics. His digital execution was complete, his name forever associated with abuse and cowardice, his face recognizable to millions of people who'd watched him assault Milena and then confess to years of similar behavior. "Option 2, David whispered, the words scraping out of his throat like broken glass. "Please. Option 2. I'll do whatever you want. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make up for what I did. Just please give me a chance to be something other than this." Lionello studied him for a long moment, searching for sincerity beneath the terror, trying to determine if David's agreement came from genuine remorse or simply self-preservation. Finally, he nodded and looked at Vincent, who produced a contract from inside his jacket, an actual legal document, printed and ready for signature, because Lionello's organization prepared for every contingency with the same meticulous attention they applied to all their operations. "You'll sign this," Vincent explained, placing the contract on the bar counter along with an expensive pen. "It outlines your obligations, public speaking engagements, advocacy work, cooperation with workplace abuse investigations, regular check-ins with our organization. You'll receive a modest stipend, enough to survive but not enough to be comfortable, because comfort breeds complacency. You'll live where we tell you to live, Work where we tell you to work. Speak when we tell you to speak. Your life belongs to us now, David, but it's still a life, which is more than you gave Milena the option of having tonight. David reached for the pen with trembling hands and signed his name across the bottom of each page, barely reading the terms, because reading would require cognitive function beyond his current capacity, would require him to think critically about a future he couldn't begin to imagine. The signatures looked shaky, almost illegible, but they were legally binding. Vincent had ensured that much, had structured the contract to withstand scrutiny from any court that might eventually review it. Good, Lionello said, standing and gesturing for Milena to join him. Vincent will take you to a safe house, where you'll spend the next week learning exactly what your new life entails. You'll watch videos of other workplace abuse victims sharing their stories. You'll write the first draft of the speech you'll deliver at community centers and college campuses. You'll begin the long, painful process of transforming from predator into advocate, and you'll do it knowing that thousands of people will be watching to see if your remorse is genuine or performed. He turned toward the door, his arm around Milena's shoulders, ready to finally leave Redwood Tavern and the wreckage of David Jones's life behind. But he paused at the threshold, looked back one final time at the man who'd made the catastrophic mistake of hurting his sister. "And David," Lionello added, his voice carrying clearly across the silent bar. "Thank you." The unexpected gratitude made everyone freeze, made David look up with confusion cutting through his exhaustion. "Thank you for teaching my sister an important lesson tonight," Lionello continued. "She wanted to believe the world was kinder than it is, wanted to believe she could exist without my protection. You disabused her of that fantasy thoroughly, violently, in a way that ensures she'll never make the mistake of trusting in strangers' decency again. So thank you, David Jones. You've made her safer by showing her exactly how dangerous the world can be." And with that parting shot, Lionello guided Milena out into the night, leaving behind a bar full of witnesses, a broken man signing away his autonomy, and a video that would ensure tonight's lessons spread far beyond the walls of Redwood Tavern. The drive back to Lionello's estate happened in silence, neither sibling willing to break the fragile peace that had settled over them once they left Redwood Tavern behind. Once the adrenaline began draining from their systems and exhaustion rushed in to fill the void, Milena pressed her face against the cool window glass, watching streetlights blur past, while her mind replayed the evening's events with the relentless persistence of trauma trying to process itself, trying to categorize and file away experiences that defied easy categorization. She'd wanted independence, had fought so hard to establish a life separate from her brother's criminal empire, separate from the weight of the Rossi name that opened some doors while permanently closing others. She'd believed naively, perhaps, but genuinely that she could be just Milena, just a waitress trying to make rent and save money for community college, just an ordinary young woman navigating ordinary challenges without the complication of being Ileone's little sister. David Jones had destroyed that illusion as thoroughly as he'd slammed her face into the bar counter, had proven that the world Lionello had always warned her about, the world of casual cruelty and predatory power dynamics, was exactly as dangerous as he'd claimed. And now, driving through the night toward the fortress her brother had built to keep threats at bay, Milena felt the weight of that destroyed illusion settling over her shoulders like a leaden cloak, felt the independence she'd cherished slipping away into the realm of impossible dreams. "You're thinking too loud," Lionello said softly, his eyes on the road but his attention clearly focused on his sister's internal struggle. "I can hear your thoughts spinning from here." Milena smiled despite herself, despite the bruising on her face that made the expression painful, because her brother had always possessed an uncanny ability to read her moods, to sense when she needed intervention and when she needed space. "I'm thinking that you were right," she admitted quietly. "About everything. About the world being more dangerous than I wanted to believe. About needing protection whether I liked it or not. About my independence being a luxury I couldn't actually afford." "No," Lionello said firmly, and the unexpected disagreement made Milena turn to look at him, confusion evident in her expression. "That's not the lesson tonight taught, little one. Tonight taught you that monsters exist, that they'll hurt you if given the opportunity, that the social contracts we pretend govern civilized behavior are fictions that collapse the moment someone decides their convenience matters more than your humanity. But the solution to that reality isn't to hide behind my walls forever, isn't to let fear transform you into a prisoner of my protection." He pulled the car into the long driveway leading to his estate, the massive iron gates swinging open automatically as security systems registered his approach, as cameras tracked their progress toward the house that looked more like a fortress than a home. "The solution," he continued, "is to become dangerous yourself. Not physically necessarily, though Vincent could teach you that if you wanted, but dangerous in the ways that actually matter. Dangerous because you understand how power works, because you know how to wield the Rossi name as both shield and sword, because you refuse to be a victim ever again. The car stopped in front of the main house, and Lionello killed the engine but made no move to exit, his hands still resting on the steering wheel as he gathered his thoughts, as he tried to articulate something important that went beyond the immediate trauma of tonight's assault. "When our parents died," he said, his voice taking on the particular quality it always acquired when discussing the car accident that had orphaned them both, that had thrust a 17-year-old Lionello into the role of sole guardian for his 10-year-old sister. "I made you a promise. Do you remember what I said?" Milena nodded, the memory surfacing with crystalline clarity despite the years that had passed. "You said you'd protect me no matter what. That nothing in the world would ever hurt me as long as you were alive. And I meant it," Lionello confirmed. "I've meant it every day since. But I'm starting to understand that protection doesn't mean keeping you locked away from danger. It means ensuring you have the tools to handle danger when it inevitably finds you. Because I won't always be sitting in the corner booth watching over you. I won't always be there to intervene before the David Joneses of the world put their hands on you." He turned to face her directly now, his expression intense but not overwhelming, his dark eyes reflecting the security lights that illuminated the driveway. "So here's what happens next. You don't go back to Redwood Tavern. That part of your life is over, and trying to return there would only re-traumatize you. But you don't hide in my house either. Don't let tonight's assault become the defining moment that transforms you into someone afraid of the world. Instead, you come work for me, not as an employee, as family, as someone learning the business, learning how power actually operates, learning to navigate the world the way I navigate it." The offer hung between them, weighted with implications that Milena needed time to fully unpack, that represented a fundamental shift in their relationship, and her relationship with the criminal empire her brother commanded. "You want me to become like you?" she said carefully, neither accepting nor rejecting, simply trying to understand what exactly was being offered. "I want you to become yourself," Lionello corrected gently, "but a version of yourself that understands how the world actually works, rather than how you wish it worked. A version that can walk into any room and know immediately who holds real power, who's performing power, and who's vulnerable. A version that never again makes the mistake of thinking kindness and dignity will protect you from people who interpret those qualities as weakness." He reached over and took her hand, his grip gentle despite the strength in his tattooed fingers, despite the violence those hands had inflicted on people who'd threatened things he valued. "I'm not asking you to become a criminal, Milena. I'm asking you to become someone criminals think twice about targeting. There's a difference, and it's an important one." Inside the house, Lionello's housekeeper had prepared Milena's room, the same room she'd occupied during high school, the same space that represented safety and childhood, and a time before she'd understood what her brother actually did to maintain their comfortable lifestyle. Fresh clothes waited on the bed, medical supplies sat ready on the nightstand, and someone had even picked up her favorite comfort food from the restaurant across town that stayed open late. "Think about it," Lionello said as they stood in her doorway, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. "Don't decide tonight while you're exhausted and traumatized and still processing everything that happened. Sleep, heal, give yourself time to feel whatever you need to feel. But know that regardless of what you decide about working with me, you're protected." David Jones learned that lesson tonight, and the video ensures everyone else who might have considered you an easy target learns it too. Milena nodded, suddenly overwhelmed with exhaustion that went deeper than physical tiredness, that reflected the emotional and psychological toll of having your understanding of the world violently restructured in a single evening. She hugged her brother tightly, feeling the strength in his frame, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her ear, feeling the love that had motivated every terrifying thing he'd done tonight on her behalf. "Thank you," she whispered into his shoulder, "for being there, for caring enough to destroy someone who hurt me, for offering me choices instead of just making decisions for me. Always," Lionello promised, kissing the top of her head the way he had when she was small and afraid of thunderstorms, when his presence alone could chase away monsters both imaginary and real. "You're my sister, Milena, my blood, and anyone who forgets that, anyone who thinks they can touch you without consequences, they learn the same lesson David Jones learned tonight. They learn that some people in this world are untouchable, and you're one of them." The weeks that followed David's public confession brought changes that rippled outward from Redwood Tavern, like waves from a stone dropped in still water, touching lives and institutions far beyond what anyone could have anticipated that Friday night, when Lionello Rossi had watched his sister get assaulted and decided consequences needed to be delivered. The video reached 15 million views across all platforms, spawned congressional hearings about workplace abuse, inspired similar confessions from other managers who'd created hostile work environments, became a cultural touchstone that people referenced when discussing power dynamics and accountability. David himself, supervised constantly by Vincent's team, began the painful process of transformation from perpetrator to advocate, speaking at community centers and university campuses about the psychology of abuse, about how ordinary people rationalized hurting others, about the systems that enabled and protected predatory behavior. Some people believed his remorse was genuine, appreciated the detailed insider perspective he brought to discussions of workplace toxicity. Others saw him as simply performing rehabilitation to avoid worse consequences, questioned whether someone who'd abused power so thoroughly could ever truly change. But regardless of public opinion on David's redemption arc, the video's impact on workplace culture was undeniable. Servers and bartenders started recording managers who verbally abused them, started speaking up about mistreatment, started understanding that silence only protected abusers while leaving victims isolated and vulnerable. The Redwood Tavern hashtag became shorthand for workplace justice, for the idea that even people society considered disposable deserved dignity and protection. And Milena, after 3 weeks of healing both physically and emotionally, after countless conversations with her brother about what she actually wanted versus what fear was telling her she needed, made her decision. She appeared at a press conference flanked by Lionello and Vincent, her bruises faded but still visible under carefully applied makeup, and delivered a speech that went viral almost as quickly as the original assault video had spread. She spoke about being an immigrant service worker, about the particular vulnerabilities that came from occupying that social position, about how David Jones had exploited her precarious status to abuse her for months before escalating to physical violence. But she also spoke about power, real power, the kind that didn't come from job titles or physical strength but from understanding systems and building networks, and refusing to accept narratives that painted victims as helpless. She announced the creation of the Rossi Foundation, an organization dedicated to supporting workplace abuse victims with legal resources, counseling services, and financial assistance for those who needed to leave toxic employment situations. She made clear that the foundation would be funded by her brother's legitimate business holdings, that money earned through perfectly legal means would now circulate back into communities that needed protection from the David Joneses of the world. "I wasn't protected because of who my brother is," Milena said, her voice steady and strong despite the camera flashes, despite the crowd of reporters hanging on every word. "I should have been protected because I'm a human being, because assault is illegal regardless of who the victim is related to, because basic human dignity shouldn't require connections to dangerous people. But we don't live in that world yet. We live in a world where power matters more than justice, where who you know matters more than what's right, where service workers are disposable until someone powerful decides they're not." She paused. Let that sink in. Let the cameras capture her expression, determined, fierce, no longer the frightened waitress pinned to a bar counter, but someone transformed by trauma into an advocate who understood exactly how broken systems operated and how to work within them to create change. "So until we build that better world," she continued, "until justice stops being something only accessible to people with resources and connections, until every service worker can feel safe reporting abuse without fearing homelessness or deportation or retaliation, until then, the Rossi Foundation will be here. We'll be the protection you need. We'll be the power you can borrow when your own isn't enough. And we'll make sure that anyone who thinks they can hurt vulnerable people without consequences learns the same lesson my brother taught David Jones that night in Redwood Tavern." The speech was shared millions of times, analyzed by pundits and activists, criticized by those who saw it as glorifying vigilante justice, while praised by others who recognized the practical reality that official systems often failed the people who needed them most. Milena became a controversial figure overnight, simultaneously celebrated as a voice for workplace abuse victims and condemned as someone whose privilege came from criminal connections rather than legitimate advocacy work. But she didn't seem bothered by the controversy, didn't seem interested in winning approval from people who'd never experienced the particular terror of being attacked while bystanders watched and did nothing. She simply continued building the foundation, hiring lawyers and counselors and caseworkers, creating infrastructure to support people who'd previously had nowhere to turn when employers became predators. And Lionello, watching his sister transform from someone he'd protected into someone who could protect others, felt something shift in his chest, pride mixed with relief, mixed with the bittersweet recognition that the little girl who'd once hidden behind him during thunderstorms had grown into someone formidable in her own right, someone dangerous in all the ways that actually mattered. The night of the press conference, after the cameras stopped rolling and the reporters dispersed and the social media analysis began, the siblings sat together in Lionello's study with glasses of wine and the comfortable silence of people who'd survived something together, who'd been fundamentally changed by shared trauma and shared purpose. "You did well today," Lionello said quietly, pride evident in his voice. "You were articulate, passionate, strategic, about framing the foundation in ways that anticipate criticism while still maintaining your core message. You're going to help a lot of people." "Milena, we're going to help people," she corrected gently. "This only works because you're backing it, because your name carries weight that mine never could on its own. We're partners in this, Lionello. Equal partners." He smiled at that, recognizing the particular strength it took to demand equality from someone whose instinct was to protect and control, whose default setting was to solve problems by eliminating threats, rather than building systems to address root causes. "Equal partners," he agreed, "though I reserve the right to destroy anyone who threatens you, regardless of Foundation policy about nonviolent advocacy." Milena laughed, the sound genuine and warm, and raised her glass in a toast. "To dangerous women," she said, "and to the men smart enough to help us become dangerous." "To dangerous women," Lionello echoed, clinking his glass against hers. "And to David Jones, who learned the hard way that sometimes the quiet waitress serving your drinks is protected by forces he never imagined existed." Outside, the city continued its usual chaos, crimes being committed and solved, injustices being perpetrated and occasionally addressed, the endless cycle of power dynamics playing out in bars and offices and homes across every neighborhood. But somewhere in that chaos, service workers who'd seen Milena's speech felt a little safer, a little more willing to speak up, a little less alone in their knowledge that the systems supposedly designed to protect them were often designed to do the opposite. And in Redwood Tavern, now under new management and operating under a strict anti-harassment policy, a young waitress who'd started just last week served drinks with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what happened to managers who forgot that basic human dignity applied to everyone, regardless of their job title or immigration status or family connections. The Rossi siblings had learned their lessons well. Milena had learned that independence without power was just another word for vulnerability. Lionello had learned that protection sometimes meant empowerment, rather than elimination of threats. And David Jones, wherever he was giving his supervised speeches about workplace abuse, had learned the most important lesson of all. Some people in this world are untouchable, and attacking them doesn't just destroy you, it transforms their trauma into movements, their pain into power, their victimization into advocacy that reaches further than any single act of violence ever could. That was the real consequence of slamming Milena Rossi's face into a bar counter. Not just David's public destruction or Lionello's terrifying intervention, but the ripple effects that spread outward, touching thousands of lives, creating infrastructure where none existed, giving voice to people who'd been silenced by fear and economic precarity. And that, ultimately, was the story of the night everything shifted inside Redwood Tavern, the night when casual cruelty met consequences, when protective love became systematic advocacy, when one woman's trauma became a foundation for protecting countless others from suffering the same fate. Thanks for staying with this story right till the final moment. You're the reason these stories come alive. If you're ready for another powerful journey, just tap the next video on your screen. And before you go, leave a quick comment and rate this story from 1 to 10. I'm excited to see your thoughts and connect with you down there.